I recognise the honourable member David Clendon.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased to take a call on this electoral amendment bill. In a sense, this bill is a fine-tuning bill. It doesn't make any dramatic changes to our electoral systems. But that is, it's still important that we continue to address the whole matter of how we conduct our elections. We are very privileged, I'd have to say, to live in a country where we have regular, free, fair and open elections. That is something we ought never to take for granted. We should continually strive to make that process as accessible, as reliable, as secure as it can possibly be. And I think this bill is in the spirit of that. It does seek to make some improvements. We don't think it's the best bill that it could have been. There are some things we would have liked to see in it which are not there, but for the most part, the point's been made. We did achieve a reasonably high level of consensus at the Select Committee level. Just responding to some of the points that have been made by our Labor colleagues, I do recall the conversation that was had about the matter of the verbal confirmation that, yes, this is I who's handing you this piece of paper with my name on it. I supported that quite in a sense that I thought it was a good idea. I'm certainly willing to, Labor clearly is determined to reopen that particular conversation, and so be it. That's the nature of the game. This bill is not yet signed off in its final place, so we'd be very interested in seeing perhaps some documentation or to see the argument put forward to reopen that part of the Select Committee. We are certainly persuadable, though having said that, we did wholeheartedly support the initiative from the New Zealand First member. It was a good Select Committee. I sat in it. Normally my colleague Holly Walker would have done that, but she was rather busy seeing to the important business of delivering a young baby safely into the world. And so it was enjoyable. It was thoughtful, occasionally humorous, and I think we got to a pretty good place with the bill. I think that I said the bill isn't all it could have been. I think it's unfortunate that there's still nothing in legislation that I'm aware of anywhere that obliges us to deliver civics education in our schools. I think it's still the case that it's possible to get to the age where one can cast a vote with very little notion of exactly how the system works, what it all means. I know, reflecting on my experience as a lecturer in political studies, having first-year politics students clearly with an interest in these things who weren't confident and couldn't articulate the difference between the head of government, the head of state, their relative status and powers. And I think that's very dangerous, and I suspect that would still be the case today. So I'd argue very strongly we need to get serious about civics education. I think the other missing part of this bill, I think it's unfortunate that there wasn't that we didn't implement the whole raft of our recommendations from the MMP Review Committee. And I say that knowing very full well that the Greens actually didn't love all of them. There were some that were not in line with what we would have preferred, but I think the Minister in introducing the bill talked about the importance of consensus around electoral practice and so on. And I think we had an independent review committee that came back with some very good recommendations, a good broad range of recommendations, out of which all of us would have felt we'd lost one and won a few perhaps. And I do think it's unfortunate we didn't just accept those recommendations wholesale. I think the selective notion was a bit unfortunate. It certainly made this government vulnerable to accusations of self-interest, and that is always unfortunate. So it's, I think some of the key provisions of the bill which will make voting easier and more accessible are important, not least of all because we have seen a significant decline in participation in voting over the last decade or more, and that's most unfortunate. We don't want to see that continue. We need to make voting accessible. We need people to be excited and engaged in the political process. I think the full online enrolment, making it possible for people to from scratch, get onto the roll and do it online. I think that's a good step in that direction. Younger generations are accustomed to doing most things online. For a very long time, it's been possible to amend one's personal details, change of address, whatever it might be, online. There have been no apparent security breaches there. So I think that was a good move and a good provision of the bill to advance. We certainly support the requirement in this new legislation that this business of loans becoming donations is some light has shone on that. People, I think, would have been surprised to learn that a political party could accept a loan before an election, which would not need to be declared as a donation, and afterwards the lender could simply excuse the party ever having to pay it back. That invites corruption in a way that we certainly don't want in this country, and I think it was a good provision to close that loophole to ensure that it doesn't constrain anybody from giving substantial donations to parties, but it's important that those are transparent, visible, and that everybody knows who is paying what to whom. The source of funding for elections is important, that we all understand where that's coming from. Sir, I think that there was the humour I mentioned in the select committee debate was very much focused on this rather unfortunate proposition about banning streamers and colours and so on. How far would you go? Would it make it an offence to walk your small child with a red ribbon in her hair, or for somebody to wear a green T-shirt, or, dare I say it, blue stockings? Where would you actually draw the line? I think what we came to, that we just let things go as they are for the moment. Obviously, scrutineers are identified, party workers can be identified, but I do think for all that there was a lot of humour in it, I do think the outcome was the right one. I think, as other speakers have mentioned, it may be timely to have a little bit more of a hard think about just the extent to which electioneering on election day is tolerated or not. And the general rule is we knock off at midnight the night before, and I think that's a good rule, despite having, as no doubt others have had, the experience of pulling down billboards at 20 to 12 in the rain the night before because somebody rang up and say, hey, do you remember that one up Boundary Road? Was my personal one. Nevertheless, more seriously, I think I have done a very quick oversight of what other countries do in this regard. And it's interesting to note that a lot of countries not dissimilar to ours with reasonably robust electoral systems often will put a 24-hour election silence, as it's often heard. So 24 hours before the booths open, there will be no campaigning of any sort. And I think that's something we could usefully consider. Other countries will have 2 or 3 days where there's no broadcasting allowed. So television and radio and newspaper advertising stops. But on the ground, the campaigning can advance apace. In UK, I believe, there are some voluntary restrictions that parties collectively agree on certain practices will or will not be allowed. And so I think we ought not simply to rest easily and think, OK, we have a sort of a workable option in what we do. I think we could interrogate that a bit more. I think we need to look very hard at the matter of polling, because we know that people's votes are significantly influenced by polling results, which may be substantive and defensible, and they may be entirely bogus. Personally, I think we need to put some limits around polling, announcing of polling results, because they are not robust necessarily, not reliable, and I do think they have an unreasonable and unfortunate sometimes influence on voter behaviour. That's one of the things I think we need to have a good conversation about. Sarah, the final thing I'd say is this bill does deal around the margins with the Maori electoral option. It does make some minor changes to it. I think it's long over time that we made it possible for people to move on to, people with whakapapa should be able to move on to or off the Māori roll, to switch between the general and the Māori roll more often than on a 5-yearly cycle. Effectively, that covers 2 election cycles. I believe there's no reason we could not do that once every 3 years. I look forward to making a further contribution at other readings. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I call the honourable member Alfred Naro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.